Hey, what's going on, everybody? Old Danny here again, and let me ask you a question. Would you say you're concerned with running end grain through your planer? Maybe you don't have a planer. Maybe you're tired of doing it by hand. I don't know. I don't know your situation, but check out this simple router sled jig that I put together. It's really easy to build, doesn't take very long, simple design, and it's even got these little handy dandy clamps in the front here for your material. So if those sound like issues that you're dealing with, let me show you how I built this and you'll be able to flatten those small slabs and end grain cutting boards in no time. Let's start it out. So if this is your first time visiting my channel, welcome. I do a lot of beginner project builds and tool reviews, things like that. So if you're interested in seeing more of those, do me a big old favor and hit that subscribe button. So I started out by making the base of the sled, the surface that the material will rest on, and this is just 3/4 inch plywood. I didn't have a full solid piece, so I had to laminate a couple pieces together and then plane it flat. Once the base panel was all flattened out and cut to size, I started on the rails, and this was probably the most crucial part of the project, so I wanted to make sure that they were as close to identical as possible. I ran them all through the jointer first and brought them over to the table saw. At this point, what I'm doing for the rails is cutting 2-inch strips for the outside rails, and that's actually what the sled itself will ride on. And then I cut 2¼ inch rails for the insides, and that's what's going to act as a guide to keep the sled from actually falling off of the base. So once I had my rails all cut down to size, it was time to start assembling, which really just consisted of making sure everything was clamped down tight and using 2½ inch deck screws to fasten it all together. The main concern here was just to make sure that nothing moved. Again, any kind of height variation between two different sets of rails will throw off your sled a little bit out of level. And that can end up giving you some deep gouges in your piece when you're trying to flatten something down. So I was trying to avoid that if I could. So with the base nearly put together, I started on the sled, and this was actually my first attempt. I got a little fancy and it didn't end up working out, so if you'd rather skip over this part, skip ahead to around the 5-minute mark, but I figured I would include this just in case anyone had a similar design in mind, and you might end up learning from some of my mistakes here. So what I was trying to do is, trying to figure out a way to put the sled on wheels, and I'm just using 4 small caster wheels that are fixed. They don't swivel around at all. And the design that I ended up coming up with was to cut 4 holes in the sled itself and then mount these wheels onto some small blocks just above it so that the wheels will pass through the sled with just a little bit of clearance at the bottom so that only the wheels will be what are contacting the rails underneath. So the problem that I ended up running into because of this design was due to the fact that there are 4 points of contact instead of 2 on the rails underneath. So what happened was it was nearly impossible for me to get the wheels perfectly level. There was a little bit of space under one wheel at a time, so the whole thing would rock a little bit. I would try to shim that wheel up a little bit more, and then the other side would start to rock. So I wasn't able to actually get all 4 wheels to contact the rails at once. And while I did want to get a little fancy with this project, this was just supposed to be a simple build, and it was starting to take too much time. If you've tried a design that's like this or similar to this, let me know in the comments if you're able to get it to work, and I might end up coming back to this later on. So here is a closer look at the problem I was describing. Once I set the sled on top of the base, it would shift from one side to the other. And even after I tried shimming up one of the wheels, it would just transfer that shift to the other side, if that makes sense. At that point, reluctantly, I think it was time for me to swallow my pride and just start over. So I took the whole thing apart and I watered down the design a little bit more just so that it has some shallow rails along the top just to act as a stop for the router. And then I just put some small rails underneath just so that it's got something to ride against those guides on the base. Once I had the sled and the base finished up, I just sanded everything down to 220 and rounded over all of the corners to reduce friction. So then it was time to install these toggle clamps, and these actually came in pretty handy. I like this addition to the jig because I built this sled with the intention of flattening end grain cutting boards. So I made the dimensions just right to accommodate a 18-inch by 24-inch end grain cutting board. So that's why these clamps are placed where they are. But the nice thing is that you can really adapt this design to whatever you need it for. If you did end up building this sled for a specific purpose or a certain size, and you need to flatten something that's smaller than this, you can just put some scrap pieces of wood in front and behind the piece that you intend to flatten, just to give it enough clamping pressure, and it works just fine. So then it was time to give all the slidey parts a coating of paste wax. And there's a bit of an open discussion on the internet about paste wax and an ingredient called silicone oil. The claim is that it's not great for wood, that it can cause cracking and some problems with finishes, things like that. I don't really have any strong opinions about it, and I'm sure it's probably fine for a jig, but I figured it was easy just to avoid it. There's plenty that are available that don't have silicone oil in them, so if you want to follow conventional wisdom like I did, figured it's just easier to get some without it so you don't have to worry about it. After I had the wax all applied, I threw the router on top just to give it kind of a friction test, and surprisingly, it was pretty dang smooth, so the wheels weren't really necessary in the end. Once it was test time, I'm using the same piece of Claro walnut that I had used for the first sled design, and you can see the front is cut out a little bit right there, but I had to stop because it was so out of level. There was a little bit of twist in the board, so I had to shim up one side, but once I got those underneath and then put some spacers in front and behind the piece, I was able to get it clamped in pretty securely. Once I had the board clamped in, I just started making some passes, and I could tell right away that this was working way better than the first attempt. I'm just using a 2-inch surfacing bit on my router right here, and I can link that in the description too if you're interested. But I'm happy with the result. I think this is definitely going to work, but I can tell right now that there's going to have to be some improvements made about dust collection because it makes a huge mess, as you can see. I was spraying dust all over the place, including myself. You can see I'm just like covered with dust. So if you do make a sled, my suggestion would be to also plan for some kind of dust collection. I don't know what the solution is off the top of my head, but I'm definitely going to work on this next. So there you go. There are some machine marks left over, but pretty easy just to give it a few passes with a smoothing plane just to get the last little bit out before you sand. In terms of finer leveling, I think what I'm going to try to do is put some non-friction tape underneath my router. So if you're having any issues with machine marks like this, give that a shot and see if you can level it even further, just so that you don't have to spend as much time planing and sanding after this. Thanks for following along, and I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Make some cool stuff, and I will see you next time.